Thank you for joining us today for the Global Reading Network's webinar on early childhood education and reading. My name is Deepa Srikanteya. I'm the senior researcher with the project, and I'm joined by my colleagues Samara Toussaint and Richard Felty, who've been helping with the behind the scenes of the webinar, as well as Lynn Alexander, our communications associate. This webinar is based on the white paper, Getting Early Grade Reading Right, a case for investing in quality early childhood education programs. The paper was written by Sheila Manji. Sheila Manji is an international consultant specializing in the fields of early childhood development and pre-tertiary education. She has nearly 10 years of experience providing technical and strategic support to ensure children's access to quality early childhood development in primary education in low resource settings. 8 of these years were with the Aga Khan Foundation, an agency of the Aga Khan Development Network, for which she served as the global head of early childhood development. Sheila holds a bachelor's in education in primary junior education and a Master of Arts in comparative international and development education with a specialization in teacher development. She was raised and educated in Canada, but now she lives in Geneva, Switzerland, which she calls her home. Our discussant today is Jo Dowd, who's a Senior Director for Education Research in Save the Children's Department of Education and Child Protection. Jo is a graduate of Stanford's graduate program, where she received her master's, and also she received a master's and doctoral degree from Harvard's Graduate School of Education. She's passionate about using rigorous research to improve practice in international education and child development programs. She leads a team of 10 researchers who support evidence generation across the globe to ensure all children learn essential literacy, numeracy, and social-emotional skills. All the materials from the webinar today will be available online afterwards. We'll be sending a link with the access to the resources.
So I know so many of you have gotten on the line from different time zones around the world, so really, really appreciate you, your patience, and also for taking the time to be with us today. You may have not had the time to read the paper just yet, so hopefully this webinar will give you a taster, a sense of what's in the paper, and perhaps entice you to go in and take a little bit of a longer look. All right, so this paper, we'll start with a little bit of a background around why this paper was developed, spend some time looking at some of the literature on investments in early childhood education and how these investments could improve early grade reading outcomes. And we will take a little bit of a longer look around what kinds of things we could be doing right away to support wider investment in early childhood education. We won't go in detail in everything in the paper, so please do use the question and answer time at the end to address anything that's burning for you. So why this paper? So I think our collective concern for all of us that are on the webinar today is that we are interested in improving early grade reading outcomes, and many of you, if not all of you, are engaged in some kind of programming at the moment which is seeking to achieve this outcome. And so there's a lot going on already. But the question on my mind and on maybe your minds today is, have we got it right? Is there something we're missing? Is there something else we could be doing? And that's sort of the impetus of this paper is, what if we were to supplement our efforts or shift our attention to before children started school? What difference would that make? What would those kinds of programs look like? And it's with these questions in mind that we took a closer look at early childhood education and tried to understand what the literature is telling us about the benefits of early childhood education programs, and in particular, what components of those programs can make the most impact for us in the early years. So what we know to date, we know that the beginning predicts the ending. We know that children come to school with a repertoire or a range of knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And we know that those things that they bring with them to school are a significant predictor of their later reading abilities, their education outcomes, and life outcomes. Today we're talking mostly about reading abilities, but everything that we talk about in this webinar today extends well beyond reading, well beyond the early grades. It goes into education and into life. We know from studies in the US, in developing countries such as India and Peru, that the skills that children have are correlated with skills that they will have later on. So for example, vocabulary size at age 3 correlated with vocabulary size at age 9 and 10. Word comprehension, the more words children could understand in grade 1, the more words they could understand in grade 3, and the better their reading comprehension. And finally, studies from India and Peru show us that the more vocabulary children have at age 5, the better their reading and math abilities at ages 8 and 12. So there's a wide range of skills, and we'll talk a little bit about them, but not in depth, of the kinds of things children need to know and be able to do before they actually start reading words on a page. And the more they can do before they come with respect to this early stage of learning, the better they're starting and the better they're ending. So why is this beginning so important? Well, the beginning is truly the foundation. The better we get the foundation, the better the outcome. The early years, we now know this period is from conception to age 8. It presents a period of opportunity. And we know that in particular, the years before children come to school is when a lot of rapid development is happening. We know from the literature now that our brains, when we're born, are underdeveloped. And everything and anything that we are exposed to, that we experience in those very beginning years, either help or undermine the formation of the neural connections in the brain. And the ideal scenario is that children are having the right kinds of experiences and interactions that support a greater number of neural connections, but not just number, but also density. So the frequency and the repetition of these kinds of experiences help those neural connections become stronger. And the stronger they are, the more the brain has developed, but also the more the child is able to adapt to different learning situations to be able to acquire more complex skills as they get older. It's also a crucial window during which time children are learning of various skills, knowledges, and attitudes that they will use when they start to learn to read. And so if you are familiar with the reading development literature or the stages of reading development, then you know that this first stage is sometimes referred to as emergent literacy or stage 0. And it's the kinds of things children learn to do before they start to read words on a page. So they learn how books work. They learn what the letter names are. They learn the different sounds in words. They learn how to talk and express themselves. They develop their own ideas and interests around reading and around books. And so the goal here is to provide children with that range of experiences and interactions that will help them create that strong foundation. Ideally, these things are happening at home through things such as talking to children, singing to children, playing with them, looking at books, reading to children. All of these things increase children's exposure to language utilized in different ways, everyday conversations, through routines, through specific activities. And the more language children hear, the more exposure they're getting, the more kinds of knowledge and skills that they're developing. Unfortunately, in developing countries, the situation is not favorable to growing or developing a strong foundation. We know that wealthy families are more likely to engage in early learning activities like the ones I just mentioned at home than poor families. We know that about 250 million children under the age of 5 are at risk, and this is primarily at risk because of stunting or poverty, but it also means that they are not getting these kinds of experiences that are so important for their brain development, but also their early language development. So this is where the question of early childhood education programs and their potential to help us get children on the right start, to get them the right foundation that they need to be able to keep going in their further learning. So what do we mean by early childhood education programs? In this paper, we're talking about center-based programs that provide children with early learning opportunities in the year or years immediately before grade 1. I say this paper because in some contexts, early years education even extends into grades 1 or 2, taking into account the fuller definition of early childhood development, which goes up to age 8. They could also go much further down and include creches or playgroups or nurseries where children are 1, 2 years old. Primarily here, we're talking about programs that are maybe 1 to 3 years in duration, that are designed to complement and reinforce the home learning environment. So they understand that children are learning at home, and these programs are there to supplement the learning that's happening at home and give them opportunities that support their learning across all their developmental domains. So their physical development, their social development, emotional development, and cognitive development. Around the world, there's a whole range of early childhood education programs. There is not a single recipe when it comes to early childhood education. You could have all kinds of providers types, children now starting at different ages, the programs are of different lengths, and the quality is all over the place. There are various reasons for this, which we won't go into today, but it raises questions and in some ways offers opportunity for research to understand what makes the most difference, and we'll get to that shortly. We know that worldwide, only about 44% of children that should be in early childhood education programs because of their age are actually enrolled in programs. And when we look at the contrast between children enrolled in developed countries versus developing countries, we see that in developing countries, nearly 60% of children who could benefit from an early childhood education program are not getting that opportunity. We also know that the vulnerable and disadvantaged children are often the ones that are left behind. These are children that are from minority groups or from a low socioeconomic status or from a rural area. It could be very different reasons, but usually they are the ones that are left behind, and the research tells us that they are the ones that actually gain the most from these programs. So for example, in Tunisia, children from rich households are 6 times more likely to have access than children from poor households. So the opportunity to access is a huge, huge issue in many, many countries. The evidence for short and long-term benefits is really, really well established in developed countries. We won't go into that in depth here, but all this to say that there are a wide range of benefits that are well documented in the literature now, not just education outcomes, but also health outcomes, criminal outcomes, increased wage earnings. And we know that these benefits are not just about the early grades, but they go well into the later life stages. There is also now a growing evidence base in developing countries, and we'll spend the rest of the time looking at what that literature tells us. By and large, it tells us exactly what we know from the developed countries. Our limitations at present is that we don't have as many studies that have looked at the longer term effects or the longer term benefits, which is less of a concern for this audience today, but is something that we would like to do more of in the future. The other thing that we're starting to see from a few studies is the issue of quality is a recurring issue, not just in the early childhood education programs, but also in the early grades, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So the programs that we are looking at, or the literature that we've reviewed for this paper, cuts across almost 20 different contexts across the developing countries. And so let's see what we have learned from this literature. So the first is that we should be giving priority to vulnerable and disadvantaged children. And there's a couple reasons for this. You could imagine that vulnerable and disadvantaged children are having less opportunities to early learning activities at home. So they are already behind when they come into a grade 1 classroom simply because of the kinds of experiences they have or really have not had at home. So the early childhood program serves to, in a sense, provide an equalizing effect. It gives these children an opportunity that they otherwise would not have, such that when they come to school, they are on par with their peers who have had those kind of early learning opportunities at home. So access, priority should always be given to children from vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. The second question that comes up a lot is how much is enough, or how much is the right amount? And a lot of the newer studies are trying to understand this question because, as I mentioned, there's a lot of variety out there in terms of how many hours a day, how many years the program is. And the literature is starting to converge around this and suggests that a lower intensity, so 3 or 5 hours a day, over a longer duration is optimal. So you might think about this as 3 to 5 hours a day for maybe a 2-year program would be optimal. But there's a big caution on this. It's only optimal if the program is of high quality from beginning to end. It's only optimal if the time that's being allocated is being used wisely. So imagine a 2-year program where children in their second year are learning exactly the same thing that they learned in their first year. That has no added value. So when we say quality, we're talking about how the subsequent years, the additional years, build on what children have learned in the previous years, and so they're continuing to advance. The third thing we're learning more about is quality, and a lot of the newer studies are really looking at this issue and trying to understand if there is a relationship between the quality of the program and children's outcomes at the end of the program and in the early grades. And This one you will see I will spend a lot more time on in a minute, so I won't talk about it just yet. And lastly, what we're learning is that programs that support parents give children an additional boost. Now, quality early childhood programs always have a component that is working closely with parents, be that trying to help them understand how their children develop, help them understand how the program, the ECE program is structured, or perhaps also additionally help them explore what they can do at home to support their children's learning. Sometimes these programs are standalone programs, so there isn't an ECE program and there's just the parent program. And sometimes they are done together with the parent program and ECE program working side by side. The ideal scenario is the latter, because we find increasingly now that when the two are happening together, when you have an ECE program plus a supports to parents, children's outcomes are even greater. So there's an additive effect. We do find, interestingly, some promising results now that are suggesting that if you have to make some choices in terms of your investments, if it's not possible to do both, if you cannot do an ECE program and supports to parents, that actually supports to parents alone, programs that help parents in the home environment, actually are having similar outcomes to ECE. So quality, I said I'd come back to this. So quality is very complex, and we won't be able to define it all and answer it all here. It's very context dependent, but it is required at multiple levels. So we're talking about quality from the beginning at the policy level right down to what's happening in the classroom and that relationship with the children in the classroom, but also into the homes and the continuous work that happens at home. Largely, people define it as structural elements and process elements. Structural elements are much easier to define. They can be quantified, they can be measured more easily. Process elements are where things become a bit more difficult to define, but when we talk about instructional approaches, we're talking about how teaching and learning happens, what kinds of activities are we doing in the DCE program, and then in the characteristics of adult-child interactions, it's how do they work together. What is the nature of that relationship that they have? And in the literature, this has been a big question, is what role does quality of the early childhood education program play vis-a-vis children's outcomes? And over and over and over again, we find that there is a significant and positive relationship between the program quality and children's outcomes. In these studies, we're looking mostly, when we talk about quality, we're looking at the quality of the teaching and learning environment. And you can see examples of these kinds of programs in the annexes. If you look at Annex 2 and Annex 3, you will find descriptions of some of these programs in more detail and what are some of the elements that have led to these outcomes. But across these studies, one of the biggest factors has been the investments made in teacher development, both the initial training, so the kinds of training that these teachers received, not just textbook and a little bit of theory, but more the practical elements of the training where teachers were able to see what it is they were going to do, experience it, and then practice it. And then also the additional component of support, mentoring support, coaching support, whereby teachers received help when they were in their context and somebody was coming to give them feedback or guide them, or they had chances to ask questions. The quality in the ECE program is quite a significant characteristic here of whether or not our investment in an ECE program is actually going to make any difference for early grade learning outcomes. However, we're also finding now that quality matters in the early grades too. And this is one finding that is slightly different from what you see in developed countries. And it's quite new. It's difficult to say how pervasive this is. But in 3 studies in Afghanistan, the Kyrgyz Republic, and Rwanda, where they did look at quality of the early grades learning environment and tried to understand the degree to which children were continuing to gain. They'd come into the grade 1 classroom with an advantage because they had been to an ECE program. They were further advanced than children who had not been to an ECE program. But quality in the early grade classroom was thought to be the reason why children did not gain as much as they could have or should have in the early grades. So what we need to see more of is a continuum from the early childhood education program into the early grade classroom, because if there is discongruence you have a situation where the gains that are being made in the early childhood education program can be completely washed out. And so those children who have come in ready to learn, ready to read, ready to further themselves, they may get frustrated. There are many stories of children around the world who have run away from their primary classrooms and gone back to their ECE classroom simply because they felt like they were learning more, it was more interesting. So that transition from an early childhood education program to that grade 1 classroom and beyond needs to be seamless, and it needs to build for the gains to continue into the early grades. For these additional elements, I mentioned that sometimes it can be difficult for us to consider early childhood education programs right off the bat. And so we did a little bit to explore what else we might be able to do if that was an issue because of perhaps finance or distance. And so there's some emerging evidence coming around television and radio and other technologies, which you can find in the Annex 4 in the paper, which is starting to look at how do these technologies increase children's exposure to language and what effects might they have on children's language outcomes. Supports to parents, there's a wide range of programs that exist. There are some descriptions of these in Annex 5 and also Annex 3. They, by and large, are recognizing that children are the first teachers, and if children are spending so much of their time at home, it could be with a parent, with a sibling, a grandparent, but that home environment is critical. And so the emphasis on these kinds of programs is what can we do to help those caregivers understand their importance in their child's development, build their skills, build their confidence, give them strategies that they can use every day. And sometimes this includes providing access to materials such as age-appropriate books, which are severely lacking in most of these contexts. So as I mentioned earlier, some of the findings that have tried to understand or compare programs that where the intervention was an early childhood education program versus a program that provided support to parents. In these studies, they were finding that supports to parents, that intervention yielded the same outcomes as, or nearly the same outcomes as children who attended an early childhood education program. However, when children had the benefit of both, they had parents who had been supported and they went to an early childhood education program, their outcomes were even greater. So what does this all mean? To go forward, I hope by now you've seen that there is evidence for early childhood education programs, not just any program, but programs of high quality that are tightly linked to programs that provide supports to parents and tightly linked to high quality early grades. These three learning environments work together, they reinforce each other, they complement each other. And the more we can do to harmonize those, to make sure that they're building on each other, the better the outcomes will be for children. And some of the ways that we can do that is to ensure that children have access to age-appropriate and culturally relevant materials in these environments, and that the instructional approaches or the experiences that are provided in each of these environments, if it is difficult for us to think about universal access to an early childhood education program or a parenting program that provides supports to parents, then the best way to start is with identifying those children or communities that are vulnerable and disadvantaged and focusing our efforts there. Thank you. And I think, as I said at the beginning of the talk, if we had to start, where would we start? We would identify those children that are the most vulnerable and the most disadvantaged, and we would start with those children, and we would reap the benefits over the longer term.
Thank you so much, Sheila. That was a great presentation. And as Sheila mentioned, the paper is available now for the public, so you can download it, and we'll also make it available after the webinar today. And if you have any questions, please do send us an email at info@globalreadingnetwork.net. Thank you again, Sheila. And we'll go ahead and move on to the discussant, Amy Jo.
Pleasure to be here to talk about this very important topic today. And what I'd like to do is pose 6 questions for us to consider when we're thinking about getting reading right. And I'll try to be faster than I was planning so that we have more time to speak. So my first question is getting what right and for whom? The framing of 0 to 8 from birth to the early grades is key in this report, and I'm in enthusiastic agreement with it. Because we know that babbling with infants and talking with toddlers, reading simple books leads to skilled reading. And this is what is key, and we need to build on the evidence. What I'd like to ask us to think about is not just getting early grade reading right, but early grade learning. Because we also need to attend to the holism of early childhood development and the fact that numeracy, self-concept, empathy, and so many more things I don't have icons for this morning are part of developmentally appropriate practice. So the challenges facing learning needs are shaped by challenges across the board in those early grade classrooms. For example, this recent study done by Save the Children across 38 early childhood education sites, the 6-year-olds there are not necessarily all ready for school. When you're looking at the results that show that less than a third of the 6-year-olds are entering primary school with mastery of early learning skills. So getting reading right needs to think maybe more about getting learning right in the early grades. Second question, who gets it right? As Sheila talked about, there's a lot of differentiation between early childhood education, but also parenting that supports it. And the investment point number 2 calls for teachers and lots of teacher training and attention to curriculum and follow-up. I think we also need parents in this equation, and just push us to think a little bit more about that. Third question, does prioritizing books leverage all opportunities to learn? So books, I think, are a little bit like puppies. Who doesn't like them, really? And I think the report's attention to both the provision as well as the utilization of books is very appreciated. It's very essential, but because the links between reading to children and language and literacy development are well proven. But promoting books, I think, especially in low-income countries, leaves out a lot of stakeholders in children's early lives. And we may not be leveraging all of the resources that we can to bear upon oral language, background knowledge, vocabulary. Not everything in the support of skilled reading development has to do with books and those who can read them. So I challenge us to think a little bit about that. Further, the longitudinal benefits of book provision and the utilization in low and middle-income countries are not well documented, nor is the interplay between materials and activities well understood. For example, this is a summary of effect sizes across a number of studies that shows that in some places materials predict learning, while in others activities predict learning. I think there's a lot that we still need to understand about these two things, where they're prevalent, where they're happening, and how their quality affects children's learning. Fourth question, for which I don't have a slide because I'm not sure what the slide would be. How does pro-board targeting work? The call for this couldn't be more appropriate in the age of the SDGs and in all the evidence that Sheila mentioned that those who are at greater risk of lagging behind developmentally benefit the most from early childhood education. But how does it work in reality? A few case studies of governments or smaller scale programs than national that have successfully done this, I think would go a long way for this advocacy point, because I feel it's an important topic, but can lack a sense of some concrete action to take or something to test. So it feels like lip service, and I'd like to see us tackle this head on. Fifth question, is our evidence for short duration and long-term ECE at scale? This lens seems like an essential thing to think about to more fully, both in terms of the evidence in this report as well as guiding our next steps. I see at least 2 key issues around scale. The first is whether this evidence-based solution is practically feasible in many low-income countries especially. A UNICEF analysis presented at a webinar last week showed us that half of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa allocate 1% of their budget or less to education in pre-primary, in the pre-primary subsector. So despite Ministry of Education having this mandate, pre-primary education doesn't feature heavily in the planning and is a tiny part of the budget in comparison with the other elements and subsectors. So the short duration, long-term ECE seems a tall order for advocates and partners, and I think we need to consider at what scale is the evidence that convinces us to go beyond 1 year of ECE? Do we think the evidence is enough, or do we need to build more? And do we know enough about earlier stimulation in combination with 1 year of quality ECE to say that the optimal formulation is short duration, long-term ECE? I think we should consider building a couple of streams of evidence in partnership with global health colleagues to better understand investments across the span, 0 to 8, that optimize learning. The second issue I want to consider related to scale is the demand side of the ECE equation. Short hours may not jive well with labor needs of parents, and especially those in greatest need. So how do ECE calls for developmentally appropriate practice span not just more traditional preschools and parenting programs that are examples in this report, but also affordable private schools, daycare centers, and less formal settings? ECE isn't just about ministries of education and provision, and consideration of both its provision and its regulation of quality ECE is needed to achieve the scale that will help us get reading right. Final question. Can we learn more from ECE data than we routinely do? This report and most other reports you'll read are full of evidence and data points, and I think it would be great if we got beyond lines and columns into distributions. To show you what I mean, I'd like to use a couple of different views of data from a Save the Children early childhood education quality study in Ethiopia. It uses the International Development and Early Learning Assessment, the IDELA. I won't bore you with the details of that, but I can tell you where to look for more at idelanetwork.org. And I want to share this first view, which is exactly like the view, the Rwanda example on page 9 of the report. So it's just lines. You see the baseline, you see the end line, and a line that links them. The steeper slope shows us that the children in the ELM group demonstrated the greatest change. Now, this is basically a control group that showed very little change, a standard early childhood education. This relates to some of the questions around quality that Sheila was raising. And then ELM, early childhood education group, this is a quality enhancing intervention that Save the Children was doing. In another view that we see often in reports, you have the baseline where all the children in each group started, and then the gains in a column above. But if we consider the distribution, here's the control group. There's still the baseline and end line means. We can see that information clearly as well. But we also see, excuse me, that where the children began in red and the children in blue, there's very little difference between the two. But the visual also tells us that there are children demonstrating these skills without ECE, and it makes us worry quite a lot about the children who are over here at the bottom end, having not changed much at all during the course of the intervention. In the standard ECE group, we see a little bit of change between the baseline and the end line. But I have to ask, for these children down here, is some ECE better than none? And finally, in the intervention group, we see an even greater shift to the right. I want to point out a few more things. The first is the tightening of the distribution, the tightening of the variation, a hint that inequity is decreasing. But there's bad news here that there are children not making progress. Good news that there's a ceiling effect formulating here, and about 70% of these children are demonstrating high levels of these skills needed for success in school. So I just want to support distributions and what we can learn, that it can help us think about how are we getting to our goal of children being more ready for school to get reading right, to get learning right, but also it can drive conversations about remediation and what's needed for the children who are still struggling to master these skills. So what does all of this mean for getting reading right? The 6 questions that I've framed for more discussion and others that I'm sure you'll bring. So I want to say that I feel the way forward is greater experimentation using longitudinal studies that track children from early childhood education experiences into primary schools, so we can fully understand how to achieve the needed continuum of quality from 0 to 8 to ensure all children read and do math, manage their emotions, manage their relationships, etc. We need to design policy investment experiments at scale in partnership with governments and private sector participants. We need to attend to data from diverse delivery systems on fidelity of implementation and use the same measures to consider shifts not just in averages, but distributions from less to more equitable developmental outcomes for all children. Thanks, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Amy Jo. That was a great presentation, and we already have a couple of questions in our chat box. I want to encourage others who would like to ask questions to both of our participants, or presenters rather. We can relay the questions to them. So as we're waiting for other questions to come in, I'm going to read a couple of questions to both Amy Jo and Sheila. And the first question is, given the importance of the seamless transition from ECE to early grades of primary, do we think the investments in ECE will have payoff without also investing in the continuum of the ECE and early grades? One question. I'm going to read two more. Okay. Is there any specific study that have shown the impact of fathers' involvement in ECDE or ECE programs? And another follow-up to the question that was asked before, this was by Jo Dowd. In addition to Amy Jo's question about scale and whether 2 3-year-olds can be assured, is a question of how governments work with private providers to expand access, and how does a combination of government and private resources in particular enable targeting of most disadvantaged populations? Okay, why don't we take those few questions and then I'll read the next round. And as Amy Jo mentioned, if people are interested, we can extend the webinar for a couple more minutes after 11 o'clock. However, if you have to leave, we understand, but we will record it, and we will also record the questions and send them out along with the paper again after the webinar. Okay, thanks everybody. So we'll have Sheila address the questions first and then Amy Jo.
Thank you so much for the questions coming in, and thank you, Amy Jo, for the really, really good critical questions that you raised that will take this discussion much, much further. With respect to the question around transitions, I think this is a big, big question, and it doesn't get enough attention because right now there's sort of the two camps. People are in the primary camp or in the early childhood education camp. And what we need to start thinking about a bit more is how can we bring these two stories together. And so you are seeing a little bit of that as you see pre-primary education being brought into basic education. But as you saw in Amy Jo's slide, the budgets are not there, allocations are not there, and understanding is not there. So you often see a lot of really goodwill and intention when people start thinking about bringing these two together. But unfortunately, the people that are bringing it together is that we need to look at ways to push up what we know, because what we're seeing a lot is that the people that are in the primary sector are making decisions about what should happen in the early childhood education sector. And we need to have a lot more crosstalk happening between these two groups, a lot more working together, a lot more understanding what children need to be able to learn where they're at, rather than us enforcing all kinds of competencies and skills that we think they need to know, that they will eventually learn and will know, but perhaps not in our timeline, because we are often in a rush to have children learning things much faster than they really need to. And it is mentioned in the paper, we didn't talk about it in a lot of depth, but there is some research that's starting to come out now that if we push down practices into the early childhood education, so if we start to push children to read earlier, we start to see that initially we think everything is fine and children are reading, and so we think we're doing things right. But as you start to look later on, these children start to have other issues. They perhaps struggle with more complex things, like when they have to learn on their own and direct their own learning, or when they have to think about reading something more complex. So there is a reason why children develop the way they do, the way they learn, and what we need to do as program developers or policymakers or educators is look at what's right for the age and ability of the children and make sure that we are cognizant of that and bringing the conversations together, both from the early childhood education side and the primary side, but also with the parents. because very often it's pressure from the parents also for children to start learning how to read at a much earlier age. So ensuring parents are in the conversation from now and starting to understand what role they can play to help you look at a smoother transition between the pre-primary or early childhood education stage and primary will go a very, very long way. I don't have any information about studies that specifically look at fathers' involvement and the impact that that might have on children's outcomes. But there is a lot of literature, for example, the household surveys that are done through the UNICEF Multi-Input Cluster Survey, some of the work that SAVE is doing and others are doing that is trying to understand more broadly how involvement at home, not just fathers, but any caregivers, the kinds of activities and experiences that they do at home, how these help children. I think from what I have seen and what I've understood from things I've experienced is that recently I was reading something about fathers and it was talking about how we tend to place expectations on fathers to do the exact same things as mothers. So to interact with the child in the same way that mothers do, to care for the child in the same way that mothers do. And perhaps we are being unfair and unrealistic. That perhaps we need to think about what is the value add that the father brings and what is the value add that the mother brings or the siblings bring, and that all these people have different things that they can offer to this child, and allow space for those to come through rather than imposing certain kinds of expectations on everyone. And I think the last question was more directed to Amy Jo, but just to say that because of the allocation of budget and that being so weak in so many places in the world, this is why you see a lot of provision happening from all over the place, from faith-based providers to private sector and many others. You are starting to see some partnership, but it's very weak. But what you are starting to see in some places is perhaps government taking on more accountability in terms of legislation and regulation of what is entailed by quality, and perhaps implementation being left to other providers. You are perhaps seeing the private sector starting to think about what it can do for its employees. And what can happen in the workplace, as many of their employees have children that could be going or should be going or need to go somewhere during the day. And so what role could they play to make sure that their employees' children are being supported in the best way possible? I'll hand over to Amy Jo.
First, I want to agree with everything that Sheila said and see if I can add some more in terms of the transition. Absolutely, I think cross-talking and getting everyone sort of on the same page is a key so that we don't have silos in terms of ECE or early grades. I also think that there's a sort of point in which the call for holism, which was sort of my first question, is it really just getting early grade reading right, or is it getting early grade learning right, is one that can help this, because getting that right in the early childhood frame is very much about play, and play advocacy about using play to promote learning as developmentally appropriate practice. So I think that's one key piece, as well as the second, which no one will be surprised to hear me say, I think we need more evidence. And when I say that, it's not to say that it's not proven that this is a good idea. I think Sheila is presenting a very convincing argument. But I think within the policy dialogue of any given nation or region, there is a drive to want to see what about in my backyard. And whether your backyard is national or regional, I do feel that there's a more convincing way to make and frame our advocacy if we can diversify the kinds and the lengths of the evidence that we have that support this work. And that's why I think the call for both longitudinal and from the early grades into, or from the early childhood into the early grades, is an essential piece of helping this transition gain the importance that it needs in this realm. The second point was about fathers. I actually am more aware of research about fathers' involvement in the 0 to 3 realm than I am in the early childhood, though I think it does exist, and we do find differentiation. I'm going to echo Sheila's call that it be the exact same may not be the best way to be assuming, but it can be very impactful, and learning more about that is certainly something that should be on our agenda. And in terms of the private as a way to expand access to regulation, I think there are probably good examples out there, but there's also private as access for elites. So we need to be careful about what we're talking about and what we're promoting. But the bottom line is really the call for regulation, defining what is early childhood education quality in the context, and having it promoted and enforced, implemented by government.
So the next question for the both of you is, the white paper confirms we shouldn't push school content into ECE. It's about lots of exposure to authentic oral language, home language, acknowledging and building on cultural funds of knowledge, opportunities to problem solve in natural settings, etc. This requires a shift in thinking about what teaching is. So I guess if you can respond to that comment. The second one is, thank you very much for this interesting presentation. There is a debate in the US over making kindergarten too academic as opposed to play-based and focused on social and emotional development. There are studies that show that early academic instruction produces initial gains in terms of test scores, but that those initial gains wash out within a few years, and in terms of social and emotional development, children from play-based preschools perform better. What are your thoughts on this in light of what you presented today? And one more question. What is your suggestion to avoid the fade out of gains in ECE as children transit to early primary grade rather? So Sheila, I'll let you go ahead.
Thank you. Great questions. The first question is spot on. What do we really mean when we're talking about learning, when we're talking about education? I think these are really pivotal questions right now. When we look at what we're doing for early grade reading and what the focus is on education in many parts of the world, we're still operating in a very antiquated expectation of what learning and education is all about. I think we need to start reevaluating and reflecting in our local context on what it is we need from our education systems, what it is we need our children to learn. And that speaks to the second question also, very much so the literature, and I was referring to this a little bit in my response to the previous questions, is, some of the problem is, what have we been measuring? We've been very concerned about what children can read, how many words can they read per minute, what can they understand on a page, but we've been less concerned about who they are as human beings, what kinds of things will they do with the things they're able to read, what kinds of problems will they be ready to solve in the world. And as a result, we have created and promoted systems in different parts of the world that encourage a certain type of learning to a certain kind of end. And I think if we are starting to see, greatly so because the evidence is starting to show, because people are starting to pay more attention to not just cognitive development, but also social emotional development and physical development, and how intertwined these are. Because don't get me wrong, we want children to be able to read, and we can do that not just by focusing on the language aspects of their development, but also by developing them socially, emotionally, physically, because all of these things reinforce each other and support each other. So I would say we do need to step back a little bit and ask ourselves, what is the point of all these early grade reading interventions? What are we really trying to do? And what do we really want to see children being able to do, not just the end of grade 2 or grade 3, but when they finish their education? What kind of learner do we want to have leaving the school system and going into the world? And I think we've touched on the fade out issue already, and it goes back to the issue of transitions. And what are we doing to have conversations, not just with our peers that are working below us, but also above us? Because the same issue can happen when children transit from early grades into the higher grades. You could have the same issue of fade out. So we need to be careful. We tend to splice off education and think about it as one tier and only have conversations with people that are working in that tier. But in reality, children are coming to that tier with prior experiences and they're moving on to something else. So we need to make sure that we're talking about the whole continuum from home into an early childhood education program, into the early grades, and on and on and on. And we need to then, because this goes back to the first question, look at what are we trying to do? And if we can answer those questions, and if everybody can be on the same page, that helps everybody start to figure out where the gaps are and how we can reorient what we are doing in terms of teacher preparation, in terms of expectations of learning in the classroom.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to take the last crack at all of these great questions. And there's so many more on the screen that are all so good. I think the question about what teaching is a huge shift that we're going to have to tackle with, as Sheila's mentioning, all the different colleagues of the different realms, because you have sort of the 0 to 3 realm dominated by the global health practitioners who don't really always think about teaching or push back against parents as teachers, something that we in early childhood say all the time, parents are the first teachers, parents are the first teachers. And yet, what does that really mean? And how can we engage in the structures that we have with health colleagues who are supporting mothers and fathers and their children in the very earliest years? I think that's essential. And then over on the other end of the scale, when you're looking beyond ECE into early grades, how are those teachers envisioning their role, and how are they feeling about the different system of ECE with its play-based approach that the children are coming from? And how do they understand their role in that continuum, their role continuing the support, so that we can, I still have Sheila's description of children who are running away from first grade going back to their early childhood setting in my mind, as I think, how do we help early grade teachers see the power in the play-based efforts and think through the curriculum in a play-based way that might be more compatible with the learner's styles, with the learner's expectations, and really make the curriculum come alive, which I think those of us who have spent lots of time in first grade classrooms around the world don't see a lot of live lessons that are coming alive. I think it goes without saying that, pushing down the academics is not something that I or Save the Children believes in doing, and the pieces of work that we're promoting in this age range really focus on how to use play to promote all the skills that underlie early grade learning. And I think this is also actually a way to think about how we avoid fade out, and how do we have everyone who is involved, from the teachers to the 0 to 3 collaborators, be they in the Ministry of Health, community outreach workers, or be they in the media, working on different kinds of programming, be they radio or available books, so that these have different ways that we're all promoting the same holistic type of play-based learning all the way up into the early grades.
Thank you so much, Amy Jo, and also thank you, Sheila, for answering the questions, and also for this wonderful presentation and discussion today. I think just the responses that we're getting from people, and also the fact that people stayed past 11 o'clock, shows that there's a lot of interest in this topic, and also just moving forward on that comprehensive approach that both of you mentioned. As I mentioned earlier in the webinar, we will be sharing the materials as well as the paper of the paper that Sheila has written out after the webinar ends. And we're also recording all of the questions that were not answered. We'll have the author as well as the discussant, Sheila and Amy Jo, answer the questions, and we'll post it online, or we'll either post it online or send it out with the materials from the webinar. Thank you so much again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at future webinars. Thank you again. Have a great day, everybody.